Hey there, it's Luis Miranda for LC Design. Today we're back in the saddle with a little bit of XParticles, where we're going to learn how to make this dissolve effect using XpInfectio and also Vertex Maker. So I had a lot of requests for an XParticles tutorial after my last one that I did. I looked at all the different techniques that I know and all the different techniques that I've learned so far. You know, we want to create like a full-on system that maybe you could actually utilize in a production environment. So I would highly recommend you guys check out my Instagram. I'm always posting little experiments on there, ideas for future tutorials. I'm also really open to taking feedback from the community as to what to do next. So yeah, so if you guys can give that a follow, that'd be super awesome. And yeah, let's go ahead and get started with this tutorial. Okay, so we're inside of Cinema4D. If you haven't already downloaded the project file, I recommend you do so. It's down in the description. This head is actually supplied from a face scanning library. And yeah, you can basically download the OBJ or an Alembic and stuff. So I went ahead and just turned it into geometry so that it's easier for you guys. Cool, so we're gonna use this as our base model, where we're gonna basically base all of our simulations from this. Okay, so first thing we want to do is go ahead and create a XP system. There's a couple of things that I like to do to kind of clean up the viewport a little bit. So see this icon, I just like to deactivate it by doing this icon on viewport, just killing it. And we already have an emitter, so let's go ahead and change from rectangle to object and drop in our Emily head high res. And here inside of polygon center, we're going to change it to object volume. And over here in emission, we're going to go ahead and slow down to 0. And instead of rate, we want to do it as a shot. Cool. So if you hide the head, you'll notice that it creates all these particles inside. But since these guys are looking really small, I'm going to go ahead and just make it a little bit bigger so that you guys can see it. And let's go here to circle. And so now when you see it, it's a little bit bigger. You can see there's about 1,000 particles inside of there. Cool. So the trick to making this guy dissolve is by creating like a point in which all the particles can then start being infected. And so there's this effect here called, pull up your commander, call it XpInfectio. And this guy works basically like a virus. And you can create a point of like infection, and then from there it'll start spreading. The way you do that is by creating this add new seed object. And so you can kind of see it, it's kind of in here. Let's go ahead and drop it down. I'm going to basically start make everything from the bottom of our neck so that it moves upwards. So let's go ahead and drop it in there. And so now when you press play, you should see that there's this effect going on. I would increase the size of it so it can encapsulate more, but honestly, it makes a little bit more sense if you add more particles. So here in your shot count, just go ahead and add another 0. So it's 10,000. And from there, you can see that it works a little bit more like a disease that's spreading. Cool. So let's go ahead and talk about XpInfectio real fast. Let's talk about some of these little settings. So we got our search radius, which is kind of like the virality, how far it can spread essentially, or at least how infectious one particular particle can be. But also this max infected is very much like the scientific term for like a virus that does that is called an R0. So it's an R0, it's the reproductive factor for a virus. And so this one, it says that every particle can infect up to 3 particles. And in real life, a person who's infected can infect 3 people. So like the flu can infect 1 person, and that one's kind of a slow one, whereas the one that's currently kind of wreaking havoc, that one has an R0 of 2.5. So this one, we have it at 3, which you should see kind of spreads pretty quickly. But if you drop it down to 2, it still goes pretty quickly, but has a nice little exponential curve to it. I kind of feel like the 3 is like, it's just way too fast. And if you crank it up even higher, it'll just go even faster. Same thing with the search radius. It'll just kind of spread like wildfire. But I'm going to go ahead and just leave it at 10 and put this at 2. So it kind of has a nice little grow to it. Cool. And okay, so the next part is we need to make these particles move based on whether they're infected or not. So I want these green ones to stay still, whereas I want my infected particles, these red ones, to then kind of get taken over by all these different forces. And so the best way to do that is by, inside of Infectio, instead of doing a color mode of fixed value, you can use groups. And so inside of here, you can create a new group. This one is for the incubation. And let's go back and let's create one for infected. All right, so now we have both of our groups. And let's go ahead and drop that in there. So basically from now on, every time they switch over to red, it basically means that they're infected. So if you notice, this has a different display mode of squares. So you'll see that they'll go from big circles to little squares. So I'm just going to go ahead and change this over to sphere or circles so that they stay consistent. So it looks pretty much the same, but here let me go ahead and create an XP turbulence. I'm going to drop this inside of my modifiers. And when I press play, basically everything gets affected. But if I go here to groups affected and just drop in the infected one and I press play, as they transition over into the infected particles, they will then start being influenced by the modifiers. And so that's essentially the basis of this technique, is just limiting the effects to a single group. Cool. So let's go ahead and I'm going to get rid of this turbulence because I'm not really going to need it. And let's see, let's have it. I want it to go upwards, making it look like if it's fire or, you know, like smoke rising. And the best way to do that is just create a gravity. So let's go ahead and drop in a gravity. And again, let's make sure that this guy is set to infected. And so now, as it turns, it'll fall. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip the gravity upside down to 180. And also, I'm going to tone down the power of it. So something, you know, like 200. And that way, it'll kind of gradually go up. But as you can see, there's sort of like, just looks a little too much like sand. So let's go ahead and add a few more things. The one thing that we're going to definitely need is a flow field. So here inside of our flow field, or sorry, inside of our Dynamics and then flow field, we can then create this guy. And so the basic, the easiest way to explain a flow field is that this can basically work as your turbulence, it can work as your wind, and it can work as all sorts of different things. But the easiest way to show you what it's possible, what it's capable of doing, is here in flow. Instead of doing default, if we put it at random, you'll see that all these different arrows are pointing everywhere. And so as we press play, it kind of gets a little bit more sporadic. And so that's because it's following the sort of like turbulent field essentially. But the thing that's really great about it is that we have a lot of control over this particular flow field. Whereas something like an XP turbulence, you could kind of dial in a certain numbers, but you can't tell it exactly what to do. And the flow field, you can. So let me show you a really cool way to make it look cool. So one thing I like to do is create a sweep. So let's go ahead and create a circle. I'm going to hide this flow field for right now while I build this. And I'm going to make it a little bit smaller. And I'm going to duplicate the circle and make this guy a little bit smaller. And then we're going to create a sweep. Let's go ahead and drop both of these guys in here. And so now you have this nice little donut shape. Let's go ahead and bring back our flow field. And inside of our flow field, we can then do surface tangent or normal. I like to use a tangent, but I'm going to show you guys what normal does so you guys understand. So when you drop in your sweep inside of the object, all of the normals of your polygons, you know, they're pointing outwards. And so that's kind of where it's telling the particles to go, is away from the donut. But if you switch this over to tangent, it actually follows the curvature of the object. And so if you want to actually create like a nice little custom path that you want your particles to go, you can pretty much do something like this where you draw your own spline or something, and then have a sweep on it, and it'll give you these nice little tangents. So but the reason I want to use a sweep as opposed to like a primitive, like a torus or something like that, is because I have a lot of control over this one. And so here inside of our end scale, I can actually bring this down to 0, and it gives me this nice kind of looking shape. But not only that, I can also play around with the start growth and end growth and kind of create this nice like sort of curvy line. But let's see, I'm gonna put this at 100 and this one somewhere here. And if you go here to your caps, you can actually play around with the cap. Let's see, and then when you increase it, you can kind of round it out a little bit. But if you crank it up all the way, it kind of gets really weird. So I just would crank it up a little bit. Cool. So now when you press play, they'll kind of follow this sort of path a little bit. But because our flow field isn't really, like the strength is set to 10, you can't really see it. But if you crank it up, you can see that it follows this a little bit more to the point that it actually traps particles. Cool. So yeah, try to keep this somewhere, just whatever looks best for you. I just know that if you crank it up all the way to 100, it's going to be very restrictive what your particles can do. Whereas if you have a smaller strength, it's kind of like it's giving it influence, but it's not completely taking over their path. Cool. So, but the thing that's also really cool about this is that you can also use cloners. So let's go ahead and create a cloner and drop in our sweep. And so instead of just doing a linear, I'm going to do a radial. And so right away you can see that there's this cool looking shape. All right. And so, yeah, they're kind of pointing in the wrong direction. So here in our transform, I'm going to rotate these guys a little bit. Cool. And then let's see over here. Yep. I want it to be more like that, so that it's kind of causing like a nice sort of convection current. All right. So let's go ahead and drop in this cloner inside of our object. And as you can see, it only respects the tangents of one object, and that's this one. So what we need to do is actually drop in our cloner inside of a connect. And so now it'll treat it like all of it is a single object. So let's go here in our flow field and drop in our connect. And so now all of them have influence. So let's go ahead and just delete these other two so we can have it. And just make sure you pay attention to where these arrows are going. If you notice, they're kind of pointing away. They're going downwards. I want them to go upwards. And a quick way to fix that is by here in the sweep, we can go to object. A quick way to do that is just to flip these normals here. And so now everything's kind of pointing upwards. Okay, let's go ahead and bring these guys down a little bit so that they're closer. And so as they go, they'll start following these little tangents and start kind of looking a little bit more chaotic as they go through the flow field. But as you can see, that there's some that are kind of like getting stuck. So let's go ahead and play around with our cloner. I think I'm going to drop down to 4 instead. And I'm going to make it a little bit wider, and also going to adjust the rotation a little bit. Let's do something more like this. And let's go ahead and shrink this guy down a little bit. Cool. So as you can see, there's like this green, but then it goes into blue. And that's just shows how much influence the objects have. So here inside of the flow field, you can actually crank up the distance, and you can see that it gets a lot bigger. So their areas of influence are actually kind of blending in with each other. I'm also going to turn down the strength a little bit. All right, let's check it out now. And so now, yeah, you can kind of see them kind of getting twisted around, but they're mostly going up, and then they're being broken up in a nice kind of consistent fashion. Okay. All right. So once you have your flow field objects working, another thing you can do to kind of give it a little bit more variation is using a random effector. Oops, sorry, let me spell that correctly. And here we can actually, let me make sure that it's affecting it. Let's go ahead and drop it in. And here inside of our cloner, actually inside of our random, we can either do that, or let's turn off all of them except for Y. And that's this way that some of them are higher, some of them are lower. And here, just kind of add a little bit more chaos to the whole situation. Also, I would recommend adding rotation to it. Something like this, so that it doesn't, go so uniformly upwards. It has a little bit more chaos to it. I'm gonna start organizing my scene a little bit better. So when you create an XP system, it's already kind of organized, but all this other stuff, you kind of have to organize yourself. So here in create a null, I like to create one. I like to number them, so it's a little easier for me. I create one called geo, and eventually I'll add even more, so depending on how many objects I have. Like, so if I have a bunch of lights, I'll create one for lights, and if I create one for camera, So let's go ahead and just keep that in there for right now. And so now we can kind of see it doing its thing. It's looking a little bit more interesting than just it dissolving and going upwards with the gravity. So yep, so we're making pretty good progress now. So let's go ahead and hide our flow field, since we kind of already have it doing what we need it to do. All right, so here, if you notice, these guys are just kind of flying for infinity until the scene resets. So a good way to fix that is to create a kill box. So let's go ahead and create an XP kill. Let's go ahead and drop it inside of our modifiers. By default, basically, as soon as it goes outside of the this box, it'll kill it. So if we go ahead and view it, you'll see that once they come up, they'll start dying as they hit the ceiling, even the side walls. Cool. So you can make it as big or as small as you want. Usually I'd suggest just making it past the FOV of the camera, depending on what you decide to go with. And also, this is really good for when you simulate it later when we cache it. If you have like millions of particles and you're not seeing a bunch of them, it makes absolutely no sense for them to be alive. So if you put a kill box, it'll basically wipe them out. And then as your simulation progresses, it actually speeds up because there's less particles to calculate. As you can see, this guy's kind of doing what it should be doing. But if you notice, these particles kind of go through all the other particles. And to me, I'm not a huge fan of that. I want it to sort of like, once it starts burning up, I want it to hit the chin and kind of go around the face and stuff. So a good way to do that is to make the head a dynamic object by giving it an XP collider. So let's go ahead and create an XP collider. And it's a nice little tag that you can drop in there. But one thing you're going to notice is that this simulation is very slow. And that's because our object has a ton of geometry. So if we look at the polygons, there's like a ton, just, like especially like in the mouth area. So what we want to do is actually create a low poly version of this to act as our collision object. So I'm going to go ahead and make a copy of this guy. I'm going to delete the collision tag from the original. I'm going to hide that. And while we're selecting our head, let's go ahead and create a new object. This one is going to be polygon reduction. And you have two options. One is this generator, and the other one is more of an effector. I'm going to go ahead and with the purple one, which is the second one on the list. Cool. So now go ahead and drop this guy in there, and right away it'll, get rid of a ton of polygons. So what we want to do is probably crank this up as far as we can get it. So you can probably even do 99, and it gives you something. You don't have to, it doesn't need to be exact. It can be a representation of the final thing. But I still think that maybe even 99 is a little bit too much. Maybe 97. Yeah, something like that's fine. Basically, we just want to have like this chin, the ear, like the nose and stuff like that, just so we have things to collide against. All right. So what you want to do is go ahead and select both, and you can go ahead and do a connect objects. I'm going to go ahead and just do a connect objects and delete, because I know I'm not going to need to make any modifications to this. Cool. And it carries over the tag, which is nice. And so now let me go ahead and hide this. Once we hit play, you'll see that it goes a little bit faster. And when it hits like certain objects, it kind of wraps around, which is nice. But it also kind of creates this little issue where things get stuck in the mouth and in the eye area. So there's a couple things we can do. The simplest thing you can do is delete these polygons that make up the mouth and eyes. So here's a pretty cool tool that you can use. It's called the Phong selection tool, and the shortcut for that is UN. And here, it looks at the Phong angle for each polygon and tries to find those that have similar Phong angles. So here, our eyes have a very consistent Phong angle between them, so they get grouped. So let's go ahead and delete them. So those guys are pretty much gone. And the mouth has its own Phong angle, so you can go ahead and delete it. It might be a good idea to get rid of these kind of like back faces for the nostrils. That way that way you're just kind of making it harder for it to get stuck, you know? All right, so let's go ahead and try this guy one more time. There's still going to be some particles that get stuck, but they're not going to be as obvious as those eye ones. So yeah, you have some, but that's okay. We're going to address these in basically a post-infection modifier, but we'll get to that in a little bit. I just want to get this guy working right now so we can kind of see as closely resembling the final simulation. All right, so now that we have our collision object in place, let's go ahead and keep playing around with the particle simulation, because if you notice, it just doesn't really look all that realistic. It still has things going down, and there's this huge block of particles that kind of just go straight up. And so we kind of want to break these guys up a little bit more. Something you can do is drop in more objects inside of the flow field, but I think I'm just going to add a few more forces to it. So let's go ahead and inside of motion, let's go ahead and drop in a turbulence, and definitely make it an infected simulation. So here it'll kind of combine with the flow field. You can crank it up even more so you can kind of see if it's working or not. Let's do something like 20. And so as they break apart, you can kind of see them kind of being moved a little bit more. There isn't really too much of a big cone that's going up from the top, which is nice. Cool. And another one that's really nice is XP wind. So if you drop in a wind, you can kind of see it already blowing it apart. Definitely don't want that. Let's go ahead and make sure that the infected is what gets it. And so now they'll start kind of pushing this way, but I'm going to go ahead and just make it pointing upwards. Cool. And inside of the wind, it's set to this wind strength. It's probably a good idea just to tone it down just a tiny bit. Cool. And so now we're getting a little bit more chaos to the thing. But if you notice, some things kind of still go down, but they're going up, thankfully. So one last thing I would add is an XP attractor. Let's go ahead and put this guy here. And an attractor is very simple. You just kind of move where you want the target to be. So I'm going to put it up top. And if we look at it, it's going to kind of overtake the flow field a little bit. So basically, it kind of makes everything group up there, which is fine, kind of. I really want it to be a little bit more random, I guess. And also right now it's set to velocity. So basically the speed, everything's kind of moving towards that speed. I really want it to be more of a force. So it's sort of like we have the flow field, but we also have the wind and turbulence, and they're all kind of working together and kind of creating a lot of chaos. And one of the things that I would say the tricks are to making a simulation look realistic and organic is by having a lot of different effects and forces working on it. Because in real life, you have gravity, you have wind, you have friction and all this stuff. And so kind of trying to recreate, realism a little bit like that can give you much better results. So in this one, let's go ahead and change our effect to infected. And so let's go ahead and see what it's doing. So they're kind of going towards it, but they're not like kind of grouping up there in a super obvious manner. Cool. All right, what we want to do now is create our post-infection effects. And this is to kind of clean up anything that's sort of left over. So when we're looking at this guy, you'll notice that some of these guys are stuck here. And what we want to do is kind of set up conditions in that if this guy, if there's things still inside this region, that they'll either get killed or they will be shrunk down until they're, gone, basically from the render. And the best way to do that is to use an XP scale. So XP scale. Let's go ahead and drop that guy inside of our modifier. And also let's go ahead and start organizing things a little bit more. This one I'm going to call post-infection mods. I'm going to create another one just for infection mods. Okay, so basically all the ones that we've created so far, except for the scale, will go inside of here. The post-infection mods will be essentially to clean up the scene once it's done simulating. So the best one to kind of like make things shrink is the XP scale. And if I just let it play, you'll see that things kind of gradually get bigger. It's not really what I want it to do. I kind of want it to go downwards. So here, I'm going to go ahead and, instead of it having a positive change, I'm going to do a negative change. I'm also going to increase the the variation. And so as you can see that they are shrinking in a kind of like random manner, but they're still ultimately going down to 0. And that's kind of the trick that we're trying to get to. Cool. But if you notice, everything is being affected. And I kind of want to set some conditions for it to actually start doing this. I want there to be a region where if the particle is still there, then it gets affected. And if it's not in that region, it doesn't get affected. So one thing we can do, let's go here into our group mapping. Let's go ahead and just hit infected. And so here you'll see it as they kind of transition over to infected, they'll start shrinking. But you can do this thing called asking a question. So here we can say, ask a question. And we can look at the age or all sorts of different things like the speed and all that good stuff. Speed might be a good one because if they're not moving, then you can say, well, if they're at 0, do it. But I'm just going to do age because it's a little simpler. I'm going to deactivate scale for right now so we can kind of look at it doing its thing. And so let's kind of pay attention to where we start noticing these particles. So it's around like 90. Yeah, so around like, yeah, I'm gonna do 90. So if they're still in there at 90, then it's going to start shrinking. Okay, so you have to do it in a few ways. It's not very, you have to kind of create a fall off and also a question. So let's go ahead and set this guy up. So now when you press play, once it reaches 90, all the red particles will then start to shrink. And so as you can see, they're now just kind of turning into like bubbles. But I wanted to just affect this area. So let's go ahead and go inside of our XP scale and choose a fall off. And let's do a spherical fall off. And so you can see that there's this inner sort of radius. And let's go ahead and change that guy out by clicking on the spherical field itself. And inside of remapping, I'm just going to go ahead and crank this guy up so that there's no fall off. It's just like, it's basically a bubble that affects this area. And so when we press play, you can see it kind of encapsulates the head. Let's go ahead and make this guy just a tiny bit bigger so it encapsulates it completely. Cool. So now when we press play, you'll see that all the red particles that are inside the sphere will then be affected. So let's go ahead and wait. And now, and so you see all of them that are inside are shrinking, but these ones outside are not. And so that's a really good way for me to wipe out all the particles that are kind of left over in the head area without, having to do anything else crazy. And so, yeah, it's basically giving us a nice little effect that basically wipes away on its own without us having to keyframe anything. We just kind of ask a very simple question, which is like, what's their age? And then, yeah, if they're inside that sphere of influence, they get taken out. Okay, so next thing we're going to want to do is we need to control the dissolve of the head, like the geometry itself. And there's actually a really cool way to do it inside of XParticles. and it's called Vertex Map Maker. So let's go ahead and create ourselves a vertex map. Vertex. So it's this guy right here, XP vertex map. I'm going to go ahead and just drop it inside like a generator. And let's go ahead and look at our object. Let's go ahead and put in the high res, like the one that hasn't been modified at all. And instead of doing source vertex speed, let's go ahead and do it from seed. And from seed is actually very similar to Infectio in that it gives you a seed object, which is really handy. So if you see it, there's a little seed object. So something you can do, you can actually find the seed object for your Infectio, go ahead and drop it inside of the seed object. And then if you hit reset PSR, it puts it exactly in the same spot as the origin of your virus. So that's exciting. But unfortunately, you can't just leave it there. You have to actually put it back inside of the vertex map. And that's one of the downsides, but that's about it. If you want to have them tied together, you can actually create a constraint, but I wouldn't recommend that because you're going to have to do that for every time you create a new one. So figure out how many you actually need first. And if you want to have this dissolve from multiple points, this is a good way to just go ahead and just create as many as you need and then do that little trick where you do the PSR. But since I'm just going to use one, I'm just going to leave it as is. All right, so we can now preview the vertex by double clicking this guy. I'm going to deactivate our particles because we're not really going to be paying attention to them right now. Cool. So as you can see, it sort of spreads from it, which is fine, but it's a little bit too fast. So let's go ahead and inside of our vertex map. And so currently it's in mode nearest vertex, which is cool. It's kind of just like finding a new one, but I like this one that's called reveal because it works very much like the Infectio. It kind of spreads in a nice like sort of procedural manner. And what's really cool about this is that we can then use this vertex map as sort of the weight to drive the opacity of our material. But not only that, we can also paint color into our points, which is really cool. And what's even cooler about that is that Redshift can actually take those colors and use it as a alpha matte. And so I'll explain this a little bit more. So here inside of our vertex map, down here, you have this blend option and also add a vertex color tag. So let's go ahead and add a color tag, which will then create this point right here. And so you can see that when we press play, it's switching over to white, which is basically matching this gradient here. So, but if you notice, we can do a few other things with it, such as I'm going to go ahead and delete this guy and this guy so that it goes and also change this color from blue to black. And so you can see it, but also you can play around with this and add new notches here. Let's go ahead and make a white one. And maybe this one almost black, but not completely. And kind of like play around with it a little bit. Okay, so when you press play, you'll see that it spreads out and it's a black and white color, which is nice because Redshift can actually take that data and actually use it as a transition color from, transparent to, opaque. So but we can actually make it look a lot cooler. One thing you can do is actually drop in a noise. And right away, you're not really going to see too much. You can kind of see like a little bit of gray in there. But basically what you want to do is crank down this guy to like something like 2, and you can kind of see some of the noise. And it kind of reveals it, but because this is Cinema4D noise, we can actually put in an animation to it. So you can actually see it doing its thing. And so as it reveals, it actually reveals a noisy or a waving texture. So let's go ahead and keep cranking these guys down, something like 50, 50, 50. So we get a much smaller effect. Instead of noise, maybe something like, let's see, electric. Yeah, that looks pretty cool. Okay, so now that we got that looking pretty cool, I want to do something that's a little nicer. So if we go from black to white, we're actually going to have to invert this because, when we're controlling the transparency to opaque, or vice versa, we want to have it go from white to black. So let's just go ahead and flip all these notches around. And here you can actually see it working in real time, which is really nice. And so you can see it kind of spreading and it's moving around. But this kind of presents an issue in that as it spreads, it's kind of still being modified. And what we want is for it to eventually turn completely black. And there's actually a pretty simple way to do that. And that's using this blend option here. So I'm going to start from the beginning and I'm going to manually crank it up. And so once you get to a certain point, this thing will actually keep spreading until it completely turns black. So yeah, you can kind of see it. We're working in real time. But basically what we need to do is actually keyframe that. So let's go ahead and start from 0. Let's go ahead and just kind of have it play. And I think maybe around here is when I want it to start transitioning over. So let's go ahead and put another keyframe down and like 100 here. And then we'll see it transition completely. Okay, so let's go ahead and give it a watch. Cool. So then now we could probably delay that fade a little bit more, maybe make it a little longer so that it takes a little bit more time kind of taking over. Yeah, so yeah, just keep playing around with it, find what works for you, but I think that looks pretty cool. And yeah, that's all pretty much done procedurally using a vertex map. So something that you're going to notice right away is that if we activate our head, I'm just going to kind of click away. You can see that our main particles are kind of like poking through. And I don't really want that to happen. And when we see this inside of Redshift, let me go ahead and get open Redshift. You'll see some particles coming out of her head. And it looks kind of unsightly, and I don't like it. It actually affects a lot of your map, all of your like specular and diffuse and all that. So let's go ahead and do our thing, which is add a Redshift tag to this guy. Redshift object, and let's go ahead and just put this as optimized spheres just for right now. Cool. Now let's press play. They're going to appear bright green because we haven't applied any material to them. Cool. So you see how they're just kind of coming out through the head, and it just looks kind of ugly. So something that I like to do for this particular situation, since each group actually can have their own scale, we can actually have them have very different sizes. And I think this can actually help out, especially sell the illusion of it burning by having some of them be really big versus others that are small. But the most practical application for this, we can actually make our base particle, this green one, actually invisible. And by doing that, all we have to do is actually just make the radius really small. So we can just put it at 0. And so now you don't see it, but you see down here, there's particles still being generated that are infected. So when we press play, they're not up here, they're not on the face, but the other ones are appearing. So from here we can actually play a little bit more. With our incubation, I want to actually make these a little bit bigger and also give it some variation. In our infected, I'm going to make these guys smaller and add like a very small amount of variation. And so now you can kind of get like a nice little variation of them, but these the incubation ones are really big. And those can be really nice because we can actually apply a material that will make those particular particles like really bright. So it looks kind of like it's, like the inside when you like light, a fuse, how it kind of has like that big burst. Well, we can make those incubation particles look like that big burst. So what we want to do, we can actually play around with the coloring as well. So in our infected, there's just, red right now. But we can, instead of doing a color mode of single color, we can actually do a gradient where we can do a parameter. There's an issue that happens when you try to color it using the display settings. So I tried setting this guy to speed world and using this gradient, but really it's just looking at the first color and kind of keeping it that way. So a way to override the color information is to use a modifier. So let's go ahead and create an XP color. And let's go ahead and drop this guy inside of our modifiers. So with the XP color, we can actually set it to gradient from parameter, which is very similar to the setting it by speed inside of the group itself. And here I can just override it a little bit more efficiently. And so now when these guys are going, you can actually see them change in color, going from the dark blue to kind of the lighter white over their period of time. All right, so what we're gonna do is with our XP color, we're gonna go ahead and start choosing nice little colors for this. I have this set to color mode, gradient by parameter. I have it set to speed. And so when you press play, you can see that it goes from this blue to this white. But since our settings are kind of set a little low, it's reaching the top speed color pretty quickly. So I'm just gonna go ahead and crank this up to 500. And right away, you'll see that it takes a little bit longer for it to reach the white. It's actually a little bit farther. Cool. So let's go ahead and choose a different gradient. This one, I'm not a huge fan of. So let's go ahead and hit this guy. Now let's do flame 1. I like that one. And so now as it starts working its way through, you can see it starts out, really dark, but then it works its way up and starts becoming brighter as it picks up speed. So that's really cool. And we can also do that with our incubation mode. And the way you do that, instead of doing a single color here inside of the group, you can go ahead and change it to shader. And from shader, you can actually select a gradient. And what's really important about this one is that we just want to throw in a bunch of colors that we want to use in here. So the way you do that is by loading a preset. And again, you can choose whatever color you want. I'm going to use this flame 6 because it has a nice little purple color to it. And so now it's basically just choosing a random color from this gradient. But purple has like a lot more a priority because it takes up more of this little frame. Cool. All right, so now we have a nice little dissolve. And before we start getting into shading, we need to make sure that our head is actually dissolving at the same rate as the particles are transitioning. So let's go ahead and check this. The way you can preview this is by double clicking this little vertex point tag, and you can see it working. And so, yeah, you can see that the particles are actually outpacing it a little bit. So we need to go ahead and adjust that by changing this search radius. So let's go ahead and put 2 so that it works twice as fast. And as you can see, it's working way too fast. So let's go ahead and split the difference, do 1.5. And it's still a little too fast, but it's really close. So let's do 1.4. And this one's actually a little bit better. It actually matches pretty nicely. All right. Cool. So go ahead and save this guy because what we're going to start doing is playing around using this vertex map to actually drive your opacity. Cool. So let's go ahead and create ourselves a redshift material. And let's drop this onto the lady head. I'm also going to go ahead and deactivate my emitter because we don't really need to shade that right now. I just want to show you guys this particular effect. So let's go ahead and open up our shader graph. And we need to bring in our vertex. So if you just type in vertex, here's a C4D vertex map. And here you can actually just go ahead and drag this little tag that is created on our object and drop it in. Make sure it's the vertex color. And so if you go ahead and pipe it directly in, let's go ahead and play a little bit, and let's go ahead and press play. And you can see it working. It has all the noise and all that good stuff that you added. But if you are to put this inside of the opacity color and then connect that to the output, you can see that it actually creates a transparency to it. And let me pause this and let's go ahead and press play. Let's get a little bit further along. All right, let's go ahead and press play now. And you can see it's kind of taken over the entire thing. And so as you can see, as it progresses, it actually deletes the geometry. But there's actually a lot of other ways you can use this. So if we were to use something like a, let's see, a poly effects, oops, over here. Let's go ahead and create a poly effects. Let's drop that in. Let's go ahead and drop that into the head. And on the effectors, let's go ahead and create ourselves a plane. You can see it's doing a bunch of crazy stuff, but let's go ahead and turn off position, but just change this scale. We can do -1. And what we can do here in our fall off, we can actually use the vertex map. So let's go ahead and just drop in the vertex map. And so then as it works its way, you can see it actually driving the poly effects and by shrinking it. And we can actually preview this all the way until completion because it's just reading the values that are being fed to it by the vertex map. And so then eventually it transitions away. So if that's a way you would rather do it instead of using a material, that's a perfectly valid option. I just wanted to give you guys that option if you decide to go that route. I'm going to just do the material route. Cool. I'm just going to go delete that. Let's go ahead and save. All right. All right. So let's go ahead and get our particles in here. And so we can start shading these guys. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to deactivate the head. Since we already got that system working, I'm going to go ahead and create a particle preset and go ahead and drop that inside of our emitter. And let's go ahead and bring this guy up. Okay, so what's really cool is that it'll basically bring in the color data right away. And what we want to do, instead of doing it in the diffuse, I want to put this inside of the emission. And so here in the emission, we can actually go ahead and crank this guy up. And if you press play, these guys are nice and bright. And so here you can actually just crank up the brightness on either here. You can make these guys a lot brighter, or inside of your XPcolor. So yeah, so as you can see, all these different colors that we're using are XPcolor, and also inside of the incubation group is driving all of these different particles. But also, if you've noticed, our emitter that is kind of like growing, it has a 0 radius, they're nowhere to be seen, and they're not showing up in the render. And so as they get infected, they actually get bigger and start, becoming more active. And so that's kind of like the secret behind making this look a little bit more of a dissolve, as opposed to a head that's full of particles and then slowly they're disintegrating, which is essentially what's going on. But this is a good way to kind of hide that fact. So yeah, from this point on, all you have to do is put in some lighting in here, make it look really nice. If you could decide to go with the poly effects route, you can definitely do that. But if you want to do with the opacity trick, that's also there for you to use as well. But as you can see, you have pretty much everything is available to you in a very procedural manner. All you have to do is make some adjustments to, either if you don't like the transition, you can add more little notches here and add more color. If you want it to be, instead of it being black and white, if you want to actually put actual color in there, you can do that as well. Personally, I would just go with the black and white value to drive that. But if you're using, like the poly effects, it makes perfect sense to use this for color as well. Okay, so make sure you catch this guy out. I used around 100K, maybe even up to 1 million. I don't remember exactly what I used, but I used a pretty high number, and I left it caching out. It took me about, I don't know, like 20 minutes or so. But for a while there, it was going to take something like 4 hours, and that's because I had a very different system going. But whatever works best for your system, if 10,000 is fine, but if you can keep adding zeros at the end, so if you can go from 10 to 100 to 1 million, whichever works for you, definitely go for that. And basically the system will kind of work its way out, and all you have to do is just put in a camera, put in some lights, and just render that guy out. Make sure you use all of your passes like reflection, specular, emission, and so that you have a lot of options inside of your compositor, whether it's After Effects or Fusion. Just give yourself as many pieces to work with and put it together and make it look really cool. All right, so that wraps up the tutorial. Hopefully you found this useful. I tried to cram in as much little knowledge as I could into a single effect, because I think something that I've learned from doing this in real world situations is that you need to create systems that are procedural and actually can work with like very fine adjustment. Otherwise, you're going to have a really hard time, rebuilding these systems. And so if you create something that can work, procedural from the very base level, you can do a lot of iteration, and that can give your creative director or client, whoever it is, a lot of options. And all you have to do is make a couple of adjustments, and you basically create a whole new effect. So yeah, I really hope that this can be applied in your sort of projects going forward, or at least open your mind to the possibilities that can be created when combining different effects. And if you haven't already, I really appreciate it if you hit the subscribe button, hit the little bell icon thing, and I'm going to be coming back with another XParticles tutorial. This one's not going to be as complicated as this one. However, if you're a fan of Mass Effect, you might get a kick out of it. So that's all I'll say about that, and I'll catch you on the next one. All right, see ya.